All right, we continue to move along in Florida's #1 radio talk show, syndicated all throughout the state. It is the Ed Dean Radio Show. The email address is ed@eddean.com, ed@eddean.com, one of my favorite groups. And they're here in Florida, but they're well-known throughout the country. The James Madison Institute. On our newsmaker line is Dr. Bob McClure. He is the president and CEO. You can go visit the website at jamesmadison.org. I want to get to King versus Burwell Supreme Court decision. Bob, for SunshineStateNews.com, as their senior editor, also my radio show, not only do we cover a lot on national, but also on state issues. Before we get into some of the Medicaid expansion, Amendment 1 with the environmentalists and all that kind of stuff out there, when you look at the session, usually it's Democrats versus Republicans. It was actually Republicans versus Republicans. Was it a weird, bizarre, or entertaining session that we had this past year?
Well, first of all, Ed, thanks for having me. Terrific to be on the show. I would say it was all of the above. I mean, the reality is the Republicans own everything at the state level. I mean, they have Senator Bill Nelson, and that's about it. They own all the cabinet offices. They own 65% of the legislature, clearly the governorship. And you really had a fascinating legislative session that obviously extended into special session, where you had one chamber that was trying to defend limited government and free markets. You had another chamber that claimed to be doing the same thing, but when you look at the actual nuts and bolts, they weren't doing it. And the big issue that they were dividing and fighting over was whether to expand Medicaid in the state of Florida, which is more than just expanding Medicaid, Ed. It really is kind of solidifying that Obamacare is good and settled policy, and it would have kind of brought Florida kind of to heel under all of the Obamacare policies.
Bob, let me, without divulging much, I had a couple of emails from people and calls. I had the pleasure of going to with Stephen Hayes. You're all, no, I wasn't with Steve, but I mean saying, back in, I believe it was March, correct? Your James Madison Institute dinner. I had a fabulous time. I love listening to Atwater. I mean, I thought that was one of Jeff's best talks on the issue of what you guys promote, the free market and education. I mean, it was just a great speech because it was very much simplified, in many areas out there, and I loved it. But I noticed that some legislators weren't there. And I was just asking around. I said, well, hey, JMI is a big deal in Tallahassee, and it was understandably so that you have a good relationship with many of these guys, but some people felt maybe a little offended because JMI, which I agreed with, sat back and said, we don't agree with the Medicaid expansion, and some of the state senators just sat back and said, we're not going to show up to the dinner. I mean, does that put pressure on you guys, or do you still have a decent relationship with some of these politicians out there?
Well, we want to win the day, and we want to advance the principles that we hold dear, which are free markets, limited government, right, economic prosperity, and personal responsibility. No politician is pure as the wind-driven snow on any of these issues, regardless of party, and that's why we're nonpartisan. The reality, though, is that while they may have had their nose out of joint because we were very aggressive, very strong on opposing Medicaid expansion, we were really the tip of the spear. There was hardly anyone else in the state. AFB was a tremendous partner, but apart from AFB, there was really no one else in the state of Florida kind of advancing this cause. The reality is we're not bomb throwers. We're not going to call names. That's not our style. There are other people that do those kinds of things, and I'm not making a judgment there because we want to work with these guys and gals on other issues. So while we may fight them tooth and nail on Medicaid expansion, they may be terrific on school choice or cutting taxes or property rights. And so we understand that. We're not naive. We have supporters that share our principles. We don't have to face the constituency when we get home, so we're not naive. So we don't make it personal. But to the extent that they may or may not have shown up to the annual dinner, that's fine. Let's work together on school choice and let's cut taxes and protect property rights. And they do that. And we've had a track record of doing that with all of those guys and gals over at the legislature.
Yeah, and let me just say this again on behalf of, and I love James Madison because I think, well, I'm going to be honest with you. I think you guys in many ways are pure because you focus on the issues. You talk about a free market approach. You're not bomb throwers. And I think that's why a lot of people like you will donate money to James Madison Institute. By the way, it's James Madison jamesmadison.org, is because you guys focus on these issues. You're not here to purposely alienate anybody, but I think that's what you do is better for the consumer out there that look back and go, well, the Democratic Party does this, the Republican Party may do that. As you pointed out, you and maybe AFP, very few groups out there that oppose Medicaid expansion, and yet people look at you and sit back and go, James Madison is at least has the credibility out there and didn't play any party lines.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And we position ourselves as the honest broker. Look, these principles are not some sort of newfangled approach to the world. I mean, these timeless principles that you and I have just been discussing, Ed, they work. We have a saying around here, freedom works every time it's tried. Freedom works every time it's tried. And there's a reason why Florida is one of the most prosperous states in the country. It's always Texas and Florida that are mentioned in the same breath. There's a reason why at the national level, our economy is bumping along the bottom. We have the uber rich who are doing very well, the poor who are doing fine, and that's a relative term. I don't mean it by any stretch, but it's the middle class that's getting hollowed out, and they're the ones who are trying to stay above water. It's because the United States has become less free. Meanwhile, Florida has become more free, and Texas has become more free. And, oh, by the way, job creation, economic prosperity, burgeoning middle class, people wanting to move to the Sunshine State. Whatever you measure, Florida is doing far better than the other 49 states. And I'll add one more thing. Florida, demographically, is the entire country, Ed. It's
Yes.
the entire country. So freedom working in a state like Florida, it works everywhere. It works everywhere it's tried. And we really focus on that and drive those debates without calling names and throwing bombs. And that's really our style, and I think it's been pretty effective. It allows us to maintain relationships with people even when we vehemently disagree with them on a single issue.
We're talking with Dr. Bob McClure, who is the president and the CEO of one of my favorite groups, the James Madison Institute. You can go to jamesmadison.org, jamesmadison.org. I want to talk about King versus Burwell here in a few moments. One of the amendments that I really said that scared me. I mean, the legalization of marijuana. I mean, a lot of other amendments didn't bother me over the years. I didn't like the classroom science amendment, but one that really bothered me was Amendment 1, which was, and by the way, there were very few groups that even exposed this. I was on my radio show talking about how we already have money coming out from the doc stamps out there and taxes that pay for affordable housing and roads projects. And as the chamber pointed out, that over the next 19, 20 years, it's almost $1 billion a year in some cases, possibly, that will be taken out to, quote, buy more land for the water usage argument. And I love the argument by Richard Corcoran, Speaker Crisafulli, that, wait a second, we can't even take care of the lands we have now. How are we going to take care of the lands that we're going to buy down the road? And by the way, Bob, I've reported on SunshineStateNews.com, which always happens in government, that we are taking money out for, quote, land use, and instead we're filling in the Sun Trail, concrete, paved, which I like, but I mean, is it worthy of taxpayers' dollars? So we're taking money out of an amendment to fund paved bike paths throughout the state instead of where it was originally intended to go.
You're absolutely right, and I think there are a couple of things going on here, and I think the Speaker D, Richard Corcoran, was right on. I think Speaker Crisafulli was right on. Many of your listeners may not know, Ed, that the state of Florida already, when you combine local and state land ownership, it's roughly 28% of the state. Think about that. It is over 1/4 of the state is in government land. Government should not be in the business of managing land. It can't manage land. I mean, bureaucracies are not set up to do anything of the sort. And so what you're seeing is 28% of the state's land being managed poorly or not at all. So all of the things that those of us who believe in good conservation and the right kind of environmental policy, invasive disease plants, animals, the water quality, none of that is being managed because it's in government hands. Where the land is managed best is in the hands of private ownership because there's a vested interest there. Second thing that's related to that is therefore the state doesn't need to own more land. It needs to handle, as you just said so well, it needs to manage what it already has well. And we hear constantly about this Everglades debate to buy more land, to buy more land, to buy more land. The reality is there are numerous Everglades projects already in process that have nothing to do with buying more land, and it's working. It's protecting the Everglades. We do not need to buy more land to protect the Everglades. That's a straw man argument. It's a simplistic argument by the environmental leftists,
right,
just to get more private land ownership, get out of private ownership and more government ownership. And it just doesn't work, and it hasn't worked.
Bob, were you surprised, and I'm sure a lot of this was political with the governor's office, they're in a very tight re-election. A lot of Republicans, hey, buy more land for water usage. Bob, how do you argue against that? I think you guys, a few others, and the Ed Dean radio show came out against it, but it didn't get a lot of play out there. What is the, I don't think this is going to be voted back out of the state constitution. What is it that voters, or I should say citizens, be wary of this Amendment 1 out there?
Well, it's like you said, over the lifetime, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And anytime you give government that kind of money, there's the potential for abuse, for payoff, for crony capitalism,
yeah, that's right.
You name it. And that's the problem. That's why this was such a bad amendment that passed. Okay, well, it passed. What do? Well, we don't buy more land when 28% of the state is already in government hands. We manage what we have, and we manage it well, and we don't bond going forward. And so what we did was we issued a commentary, kind of this 10-step process of the things you need to be doing. And many of the funds would, if they would, Everglades restoration would work better, for example, if they already funded the projects that have been in existence, Ed, for 20 years, since Jeb was in office, since before Jeb was in office.
Right.
Don't buy more land. Let's fund the projects we have in place now and get it right.
So, Bob, what do you tell the listener out there? Bob, they're going to sit back and email me today, and they're going to sit back and say, well, Bob, the money's been approved to be spent by the voters. Where should that money be spent if it's got to be spent by law?
Well, I would say that primarily it needs to be spent focused on projects that are already in place. Okay, so watersheds in and around the Everglades, water quality, the proper management of land that currently the state cannot manage that it already has in place. The management of invasive species, of invasive animals, of those kinds of things. So there's a list of 10 different things that your listeners can see, and they can go to jamesmadison.org and look for our Amendment 1 analysis.
Right.
That it do not involve simply buying more land and letting it sit idle. Land in Florida, if not managed properly, goes to seed. There's a reason why nobody wanted to live here until they had air conditioning and mosquito control and water control. It was because it was a heck of a place to live. And so that's what the state of Florida is currently not doing. They're not managing the land properly now. So whether it's water quality, managing the land they have properly now, and all the other things that I've just mentioned, that's where we need to start with the state. And the legislature actually did a pretty good job of that. They're not into land buying. Those on the left really just wanted to buy more land. But to what end? It doesn't do any good.
It feels good, but there's no substance to it. We're talking with Dr. Bob McClure, President and CEO of the James Madison Institute. Check out the website, jamesmadison.org, jamesmadison.org. Before I let you go, take a few moments. I wasn't shocked, but I was still a little disappointed of last week's King versus Burwell dealing with tax subsidies on Obamacare.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I wasn't shocked, but we're always hopeful, aren't we? And yet what we saw was the 6-3 vote to essentially kind of institutionalize Obamacare. Let's be clear, though, that simply because 6 lawyers in Washington, D.C. decided to say that something was constitutional, it's still a bad law. It doesn't we can argue the merits of its constitutionality. I think you and I know, and probably the majority of our listeners understand it's not constitutional. But having said that, let's just assume it is for absurdity's sake. The reality is, it's not even if they want to say it's constitutional, it's still bad law.
Right.
So we still need to look to repeal and replace a very, very bad law, regardless of what 6 lawyers say in Washington, D.C.
Let me, again, before I let you go, let me bring this down to a Florida level here. And I may mix a different issue that you may not cover with James Madison, but I'm just going to use an analogy here. I'm like you, when I do my Dean's List every week on SunshineStateNews.com, I try to cover more of a free market area when it comes to education or when it comes to fiscal issues. But having said that, we have a group of Republicans and Democrats on the state Senate side. And before I go further, I always sat back and said, guys, why don't we wait? If you're at least going to go down this road, why don't we at least wait to see what the Supreme Court's decision will be on King versus Burwell? I think the Medicaid expansion argument most likely will come back up. But having said all this, there are politicians on a few in the House, mostly on the Senate, that have sat back and go, well, it's the law of the land. Let's just accept it. I'm like, well, wait a second. And again, I don't want to get off on a weird issue, but when you look at a social issue like abortion, it may be the law of the land, but the state puts restrictions. The federal government's involved in education, but yet the state of Florida sits back and says, instead of more government, we want to allow more of a free market system. When you listen to the politicians on the Senate side, Dr. McClure, talk about Medicaid expansion, they act like it's going to go away unless we accept Obamacare on a state level.
Well, I think you've hit it on the head. The reality is it may be law for something, the law of the land, but it doesn't mean it's good law. So why would we buy into something that's bad for Florida? The reality is if we expanded Medicaid, the United States government was going to guarantee, this is in their words, 100% over the next few years payment towards Medicaid. We would have, by some estimates, 700,000 people sign up for Medicaid. After that, the federal government was promising, and I put that in quotations, 90% funding. Ultimately, it would go away. Well, guess what? When all that funding were to go away, we'd still have 700,000 people in Medicaid, and we'd be on the hook. You and I and all of your listeners as taxpayers will be on the hook to pay that. That's if, and it's a big if. That's if the federal government did what it promised it would do, which it, by the way, has not done under No Child Left Behind when George W. Bush was in the office. By the way, it has not done what it promised with the Everglades funding going back before Jeb Bush. There's a history here. Why would we entangle ourselves with a federal government that makes empty promises and then holds us hostage, holds the state of Florida hostage, the world's 19th largest economy, Ed, hostage if we don't do exactly what they want us to do? Why would we entangle ourselves with the federal government? Instead, open up the market, level the playing field, have transparency in health care, and you would see prices come down, and you would see access to quality care. And that's the other important thing. Access to insurance coverage is not access to quality care. You would see access to quality care come about if you use the free market to impose discipline on a dysfunctional healthcare system.
I'm with you. It's like, guys, the government's still going to fund Medicaid. And by the way, real quick, I got to ask this question. I understand the thought process, which I agree with you guys. If we go down this road, the thought process is then we need to turn into a free market type of a system. Okay, that's great. My question is Dr. McClure, why do I want to wait to accept Obamacare money when I can do it now?
Well, if I think I hear your question right, what you're asking is, why would if
I got 20? Go ahead. I got about 20 seconds. I'm sorry.
Yeah. If I understand the question, Ed, accepting money now from a federal government would hold the taxpayer hostage for the rest of their lifetime.
Right.
And guaranteed access to coverage is not access to care. Doctors are dropping out left and right, and the quality of care in Medicaid is lousy. There are better alternatives found in the free market.
Dr. Bob McClure, the president and CEO of the James Madison Institute, jamesmadison.org. Have a good weekend, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This is the Ed Dean Radio Show.